All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials World podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? Of course, we love metal and we love punk. Would you agree with that, Brian?
No, I don't like either of them.
God fucking damn it. All right. Well, I like both metal and punk. And one of my favorite bands out there is a band that actually broke up a couple years back and are never getting back together. In fact, Taylor Swift actually wrote that song about this band. And that band is Slayer. They're most famous for songs like, Ride the Lightning and,
He
stuff.
sells I'm the Man.
Yeah, they're also famous for, I think, that song Blind and Clown and the F Word song. They're famous for a lot of metal songs.
Yeah, this is fair.
And I was thinking, wait. I'm getting some word from our handlers here, and they're saying that Slayer announced they're getting back together. Taylor Swift, did you lie to us?
She must have had bad sources on that.
Yeah, she must have. So you know what? With apparently Slayer getting back together, I just found this fucking out. How about let's review their most critically and commercially successful album, Undisputed Attitude. But before we get into our review, Brian, do you have a perhaps cringe, perhaps generational, perhaps moment of the week?
As a matter of fact, I do. So, Taylor, as you mentioned, Slayer have announced they are getting back together. They're playing two large festivals in late 2024, early 2025, I believe late 2024. One of them is Riot Fest. This is very funny to me for a couple of reasons. Slayer, I would say they retired in 2019. I would not say they broke up. It seems like they retired. Tom Araya?
Yeah, I think it's Tom Araya.
That's what I thought too. Tom has allegedly wanted to break up since the early 2010s because he hates touring, which he's pretty open about and always has been. And he has neck problems, I guess. He's hated being in Slayer for a long time, or at least hated touring. So in 2019, they wrap up their farewell tour. It's a big thing. Slayer, of course, huge band. I don't think I need to give too much of an overview, but I think it's probably important to say that I feel, and I think a lot of people would agree, Slayer kind of went out on top. For a band of their legacy, they kind of had a wilderness era in the 2000s, the late 90s. But their last three records, that's Repentless, World Painted Blood, and Christ Illusion, are pretty highly regarded by metal fans. A lot of people consider Christ Illusion like one of their best albums. So a good time for them to break up. They'd put out a series of great albums, arguably as great as anything they did in the 80s. And they could go out kind of on top. Lead guitarist Kerry King immediately starts whining very publicly, pissing and moaning. And I shouldn't say pissing and moaning. Maybe he has a point. I don't know what's going on. He didn't want to break up. He misses it. He wasn't ready to. He's lost his primary source of income. He was not consulted by the rest of the band. I kind of find that hard to believe that they just left him with no warning. But Kerry King very publicly upset about the dissolution of Slayer. Starts talking about how he's going to form this new band. He won't tell us who's in it. And he straight up says, it's going to sound just like Slayer. Why would it sound different? This is just what I do. He's talking about this for years. About a month ago, the first Kerry King solo, or I don't know, maybe his new band will end up having a name. Right now, it's just credited to Kerry King. But the first single by Kerry King post Slayer releases. It's called Idle Hands. And it's about what you would expect based on what he said. And Kerry King is not the primary songwriter of Slayer. He is an important songwriter, but not the primary one. And this band kind of just sounds like if you heard him, you'd be like, it's a pretty competent Slayer knockoff band. But it's kind of corny and you're like, all right, whatever. It's funny to me, immediately after this single drops, Slayer now announced that they're getting back together. And I just think why? Is it because Araya is so frustrated by Kerry King pissing and moaning publicly or releasing this crappy Slayer knockoff single that he's like, oh, fine. I'd rather just get back together than have this out there. It just seems like such a goofy way to continue their legacy when they were in such a good place. Everything they did in the 80s, untouchable. There's really nothing else like that in metal. They have kind of an awkward period in the 90s, which is part of why we're here today. And basically, by the end of the 2000s, they kind of find their groove again and they lock in and they put out a few great albums. But all I can think about is Araya born 1961, Kerry King born 1964. They're right on the cusp between Boomer and Gen X. And I can't think of anything more indicative of that than just both of them and their absolute refusal to let go of something, particularly Kerry King, who's just like, what I'm doing isn't that good anymore. I don't really need to keep doing it. I don't really have anything to add to it. But boy, I just got to keep doing it.
You know what's funny, Brian? You were talking about, of course, Kerry King sort of pissing and whining and Tom just being like, all right, whatever. I know I mentioned Taylor Swift jokingly earlier, but it is kind of like a relationship thing when there's like a breakup between certain people and there's like just one partner just wants to do like some big show of like, no, I want to get back together. I really mean it. And then Tom's like, all right, fine. I'll give you one more motherfucking chance, you little bitch. Like, that's kind of what it sounds like
That's
to
how
me.
it seems. Like, what does Tom get out of this? If he hated being in Slayer for almost 20 years, if his neck is killing him, if he like publicly talks about hating being on tour, hating doing interviews, hating playing live a lot of the time at this point in his life.
He is in his
Yeah,
60s.
sure. No judgment. And by the way, I don't judge Tom for not wanting to do it. I don't judge Carrie for wanting to continue doing it. What's funny to me is the immediate turnaround from we're breaking up to, well, I'm going to put out this band that sounds exactly like Slayer, and to just publicly be like, well, yeah, it's going to sound like Slayer.
That's always my favorite, like, post band or just like any side project of any band. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna sound like what I normally do in my regular band. And that's like, why are you even doing it then? What's the fucking point? I never understood that.
Most side projects, especially in metal, do usually end up that way, but nobody ever says it publicly. David Raymond didn't say when he put out his solo album, yeah, it's just going to sound like Disturbed, but less catchy. He was like, oh, it's a whole different thing, man. It's totally different. It's crazy.
It's ball to the wall, bro.
Yeah.
It's psycho shit.
Harry just straight up was like, yeah, it's going to be like Slayer, kind of, but it's not catchy. The vocals, it sounds like someone doing an impression of Tom. It's goofy.
Well, you know what, Brian? Talk about Slayer, but not catchy. Let's get into some details on this album here. And I'm kidding, obviously. I don't hate this album, but this album is a very interesting time capsule, I will say. I'll just say that. So, some of the details. So, this is, once again, Undisputed Attitude. Came out in 1996. It does have a parental advisory sticker. Our first album in quite a long time that did. So, these little bitches self-censored themselves. What cucks.
It's so funny when bands like with names like Slayer put the parental advisory sticker on there.
Wouldn't want your teenagers listening to this now, should they? Yeah. And of course, once again, it was performed by the band Slayer. As we mentioned, the personnel, so of course, Tom Araya on bass and vocals, Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman on guitars, and Paul Bostoff on drums. And this was actually Paul Bostoff's second studio album. Definitely not his second full original album for this band, because we're just going to get into it right away. There's only one actual Slayer song on this whole album. Otherwise, it is a covers album. Although, two songs are by Jeff Hanneman's previous band, or was it like a band that he...
Side project.
Project, okay.
Yeah, I figure as we go along, I'll do kind of a band by band thing. But this is, like you said, this is a weird time capsule. This captures Slayer fully in what I would call their awkward period. 80s are great for Slayer, arguably better than they are for any other thrash band. They're consistently getting better, darker, heavier, tighter. In the 90s, it's not like a disaster, but they kind of start to falter. And I think they start to question themselves, especially post Nirvana.
I was going to say, speaking of Nirvana, most 80s metal bands had a real hard time in the 90s.
Slayer did a lot better than a lot of other metal bands, but I think you can hear it on the albums before this. They're rehashing things they've done in the 80s, and I sort of feel like this album, Undisputed Attitude, is literally Slayer going, we need to make sure everyone knows that we're alternative too. By this point in the 90s, thrash is maybe starting to seem a little bit conservative, a little bit less edgy. I kind of wonder, is this them trying to make sure everyone knows, like, oh, we're not like just dumb metal guys. We like underground shit,
Well, you know what's funny, actually? I was talking about earlier about the one Slayer song. It's the most alt-rock sounding song on the album, which is hilarious to me. Like, almost all the others sound like more thrashy than this fucking actual Slayer song. It's hilarious.
That track is so confusing to me because it would be awesome if, for me, so hardcore punk, like early hardcore punk from the 80s, probably my favorite music ever. Like 70s, 80s punk, that's my fucking thing. Love it. Obviously, that's an influence on Slayer. You can hear it throughout their career, but especially like when you get to like Rain and Blood, heavy hardcore punk influence on there. But if they were going to do an original on here, why not play up their hardcore influence and write like a super thrashy song?
Yeah, not like a song that sounds like a fucking Alice in Chains knockoff.
Yeah, it sounds like Alice in Chains or something.
All right, we're talking about albums. So this was released on American Records. It was produced by Dave Sardy and the band Slayer. The standard American edition is 33 minutes and 1 second long, although we're going to review the European standard edition, which is 35 minutes and 15 seconds long. It has an additional song, which apparently you learned today that that's not the standard American edition. The standard American edition is missing one song.
Yeah, so that's the version that I had that I'd gotten from the library as a kid, and it had the GBH cover on it. So I just assumed that was it. And I was looking over different track listings, and I was like, fuck. And the reason I noticed is because the GBH is very important to this album. Not very important. That's an overstatement.
And then this album sold about 163,000 copies in the US, which is their single lowest selling album with verified sales I could find. So that's kind of funny.
And I have an idea on why that is.
Well, actually, once we get to the Amazon reviews, I think I know exactly what we're going to talk about with that. But...
I'm excited to get there because I want to see if the Amazon reviews reflect my theory.
Oh, hell yeah. And then speaking of Amazon, so it has a 4.7 out of 5 on Amazon, and on Rate Your Music, it is a 2.79 out of 5. And let's just get into the Amazon reviews right away. So my first review here is from Molus Zarian, who gives this 5 stars. And the header of the review says, "Gatekeepers hate this album." And the body of the review says, "I just discovered the raft of Slayer fans that hate this album, which prompted me to write this review ASAP. You won't see, quote, verified purchase, unquote, because I've been listening to the same CD of this album for 20 years. This motherfucker's been listening to this album for 20 fucking years.
It's surprising to me that Slayer fans are the gatekeepers who hate this album and not like hardcore guys that like hate metal.
Well, I will say, to be fair, Brian, if anybody is going to beat hardcore punk gatekeepers, it would be thrash metal gatekeepers.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so sick of people complaining about gatekeeping.
I remember we talked about it, right? And like, for the most part, I don't really care. As long as you're not doing it for like bigoted reasons, I don't really care about gatekeeping. I
don't think gatekeeping is real half the time. Half the time it's like if I say like I think that pop punk sucks, I don't think Good Charlotte and All Time Low is punk. And there's always someone that's in there that's like punk is actually like an attitude, you know? So if you like All Time Low, even though people hate it, that's actually more punk. And you're gatekeeping. It's not gatekeeping to like take a style or a subgenre seriously. Like, it's not.
No, absolutely. All right, but yeah, I'm just going to finish up this review real quick here. So it says, if you enjoy any of the bands covered in this album or old school 80s speed metal whatsoever, you will find tight, crisp, energetic, and tasteful renditions herein. The guitar solos are particularly well done, with the band's dive bombs, finger taps, and detune. I can't even say this word, so I'm not going to finish it. It looks like Arab something. Fitting the punk genre perfectly. But enough shop talk. Hanneman shows a true love and understanding of the genre, as he truly reinvigorates some beloved punk classics. It's a shame that, despite Hanneman's stated reverence for this material, so many quote-unquote hardcore Slayer fans are put off by this album. It's not to be missed. So this is the anti-gatekeeper here, Brian. You and him should argue in the comment sections. No, I'm just kidding.
I largely don't disagree with what he's saying about the content of the album. I don't entirely agree. It's just like, I understand why some thrash metal fans would not like this album. You know, a lot of people that are into metal, they don't like short songs. They don't want a song with 2 parts in it.
No,
they're fucking lost. They're the best songs in the world, but I understand why that's not what they're into, you know?
They're like, if my song is at 12 minutes and has a 3.5 minute long drum and guitar solo each, I don't want to fucking hear it. And to me, it's just like, I got a life to live, dude. Like,
God. Maybe someday we'll talk about like Dream Theater or Tool or something.
Oh God, dude, I would literally rather fucking like do a lot of things to various parts of my reproductive system than have to listen to an entire Dream Theater album. I'm gonna be real
I've listened
here.
to a bunch of Dream Theater, man. That shit sucks. The thing is, I've gone through lots of phases. I've delved into a lot of different types of music, and I love a lot of prog metal, so I have listened to some Dream Theater, but boy, that shit sucks.
Yeah, it's not good. I'm gonna be real here. It's not fucking good. But, you know, speaking of people who think this thing is not very good, so our next review here is from Josh, who gives us 1 star. And the header of the review says, "Why?" And the body of the review says, and before I continue, I have 2 all caps reviews here, and this is one of those all caps reviews. So the body of the review says, "Why do people listen to Slayer? Because people are retarded. Every Slayer album put out sucked. And this right here is the worst album ever made. Congratulations, Slayer. Just won an award for worst band ever. Metallica rules.
You know what? This guy rules. I don't even give a shit. This guy's fucking cool. Also, what throws me off again is ending with Metallica rules, because I assumed that this was like a hardcore guy that was pissed off that they covered like classic hardcore songs. But no, it's a fucking Metallica mega fan.
You know what? That's the thing that you really don't get anymore is like metal fans who are just like abrasively like fucking bigoted in some way or another online. You don't really see a lot of those people posting anymore.
Yeah, no, not as much. I think Phil Anselmo kind of blew their cover.
Yeah, right. Like, I can't even tell you how many conversations I had in high school where everyone was like, oh yeah, fucking Suicide Silence is gay. Like, nobody does that anymore, it seems like.
I mean, I'll be like that about bands I don't like. Like the pop punk thing, a lot of the hot topics. I'm just so sick of millennial nostalgia. I'm so fucking sick of I'm so sick of like actually like Dashboard Confessional had some fucking bangers. Like, I don't know.
And, you know, speaking of bands that had bangers, or maybe this person thinks otherwise. So our final review here, I say my final review, because I want to get into maybe one of your Amazon reviews that you found. But so Cloud McCarris gives this 1 star. And the head of the review says, this sounds like punk. And the body of the review says, I'm a huge Slayer fan, you know, but I was so disappointed in this album because it sounds like punk. Who would have imagined that a cover album dedicated to covering hardcore punk songs would sound like hardcore punk? I feel so deceived and I want my money back, Slayer.
Oh, this guy's making fun of the other people, huh?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, Cloud McCarris, just like Josh, you both rock. You get the mouse seal of approval.
Yeah, these are our boys. We're gonna get them on the show.
Yeah, right. Well, to be fair, I think Josh might have joined some prison gangs recently that Kerry King might think are really cool. Nah, I mean, we'll get into that later. You know, when we're talking about Kerry King, right, before we get into the track listing here, and we'll definitely mention it on one of the songs here, but I do think it's very funny that Kerry King is only 1K away from having, of his name being away from his personal politics. I think it's really fucking awesome.
Ooh.
I mean, okay, so that's the thing, though, is that once we get to that track, and it's track number 6, you know, and I'm just going to get this out of the way right now. Like, Slayer in general have played with a lot of very far-right lyrical themes. Of course, we all know Angel of Heaven is based off of Joseph Mengele. Kerry King has said some extremely problematic things in the past.
Yeah, like he said that we should vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Yes, and he also
Classic
said that
white
Trump,
supremacist talk.
he also said that Trump was rather embarrassing. And I'm like, damn, bro, the Cheeto in chief get you angry? No.
Yeah.
All right, but yeah, enough about the band's personal politics for now. So let's get into some of the track listing here. Now, to be honest, Brian, I don't really have that much to say about most of the individual tracks. I'm going to be real here. Like, I don't think any of them are truly awful except for like maybe 1 or 2, but I just don't really have much to say about the covers overall, if I'm going to be real here. So I will let you lead here. I will let you lead here.
I had anticipated that. I think what I'm going to do is instead of going track for track, I'll go band for band.
Let's do it. Yeah. So first is Verbal Abuse. Those are the first, I think, 2. Yeah, first 2 songs.
First 2 tracks, first 4 songs. Slayer cover 5 different Verbal Abuse songs over 3 tracks on this album.
Oh, yeah, because these are splits. Right. Okay.
So, Verbal Abuse was formed in 1981 in Houston. They relocated in 1983 to San Francisco, where they recorded their album Just an American Band. Every song on this album is from Just an American Band. They're hardcore punk. They're the most nondescript band on here, which isn't to say they're bad. Verbal Abuse made great hardcore punk, catchy songs, slow, angry, pissed off, but they're basically what you imagine when someone says early 80s hardcore. They're also easily the most obscure band that Slayer chose to cover, which I think is probably why they chose so many of their songs. Like, you know, of course, people know Suicidal Tendencies, people know Minor Threat, people know most of the bands on here have some sort of audience outside of punk. Verbal Abuse kind of don't. If you're into hardcore, you know them, but if you're not, you just won't know them. These songs, to me, actually work really well with Slayer. There are 2 approaches they take in adapting hardcore punk songs to their style that you see on this album. One is if a song is kind of ambitious and weird and it kind of is expansive for hardcore, they rearrange it and they find a way to make it sound like a Slayer song. The other tact that they take, and I would say the more dependable one, is they pick a hardcore song that's catchy, that's short, that's tight, and they just tighten it up even more and they play it a little bit faster. That's basically what they do with the Verbal Abuse songs. Because they're just short, tight, crunchy, riff-based songs that are just pissed off, they're very easy for Slayer to cover. They make them sound like Slayer songs, which is true of most tracks on this album. It works really well for them. Again, I wouldn't recommend Verbal Abuse to someone who's just getting into hardcore. This isn't like Minor Threat or Black Flag. But if you like that stuff already and you want some more, Just an American Band by Verbal Abuse, very good hardcore album.
Hell yeah. So good little crash course on verbal abuse. So the next two tracks here are by TSOL. They are Abolish Government and Superficial Love. What is TSOL, Brian? Because once again, this is a band I had no idea about.
TSOL are maybe my favorite band on this album. There's a couple bands on here. I like every band that's featured on here a lot. TSOL were a huge band for me in high school. TSOL stands for True Sounds of Liberty. One of the corniest names in hardcore punk. So glad they went with the abbreviation for that.
That sounds like a 90s pop country band, I'm going to be honest with you. Or like a post-Iraq War country album. I'm going to be real here,
Oh my
man.
God. So True Sounds of Liberty, formed in Long Beach, California. They're really interesting and kind of important in the development of punk music because they're an early example of what we call death rock. Death rock mutates out of hardcore punk and it has elements of early goth rock in it. So it's got these very trebly guitars, really theatrical vocals, but it's got like punk tempos to it. TSOL were one of the first artists to kind of do that thing. Singer Jack Grisham has a very California, snotty, flamboyant, way of singing. Kind of reminds me of Jello Biafra sometimes, or like Dave Vanian from The Damned. The guitars are very trebly, very like harmonic. This is actually two different tracks on the first TSOL album, Superficial Love and Abolish Government. They mesh them into one song, which Slayer do a lot here. I think because so many hardcore punk songs are so short that it's a way for them to make them a little longer for their audience. My big note with the TSOL thing, the big difference here is Abolish Government, the TSOL version, ends with Jack Grisham saying, Ronald Reagan can go to hell, which really works as he's like this 17-year-old snotty California kind of surfer kid, Tom Araya of Slayer changes that to Bill Clinton can suck my dick. In his gravelly Tom Araya voice, and he sounds like such a hill. I'm like, fuck Bill Clinton. I don't give a shit, but he sounds like such a fucking hick on this when he does it. This cover for me, and I love TSOL, one of my favorite bands in high school. Pretty tasteless band in a lot of ways. A lot of songs about necrophilia, and interesting for hardcore because they did sing a lot of satanic lyrics, which again, different for punk. But the thing with this cover is Jack Grisham, again, he has a very theatrical voice, very surfer kind of nya kind voice, and Tom Araya has a very serious kind of shouty voice. So you take away the Jack Grisham kind of camp vocals, and then again TSOL have these kind of gothy, hollow sounding light guitars that made them stand out for hardcore punk. Of course, Slayer do away with that. They have just this thick kind of distorted drop D type sound, which is Slayer, and it's a great tone. But in this instance, I kind of feel like turning TSOL songs into Slayer songs kind of robs them of the things that make them stand out. Not bad covers, and I like that they're on here. I like that this is clearly Jeff Hanneman showing off all the cool bands he likes. I think he was really proud that they weren't covering Black Flag. They weren't covering The Germs. So you know what I mean? They were covering kind of slightly lesser known bands. But this is not my favorite cover on this album. And it's fine. I'm actually curious kind of what your thought on some of these are, since you hadn't heard the originals. Like, were there any that stuck out to you?
Well, actually, so let's get actually into that because we were talking about Jeff Hanneman. So these next two songs here, Can't Stand You and D-Damn, which I believe stands for something or another. Drunk Driving, something like that.
Drunk Drivers Against Mad Mothers.
Yes, that's it. So those two songs were for a side project of Jeff Hanneman's called Pap Smear. So, as we talk about songs that I do or don't like, I think we'll go through the whole history section, then I'll mention songs that I do or don't like particularly. But one song I really did like, though, was D-Damn. I actually really like that song quite a bit. I really liked the fact that, you know, it is a punk song, but it's got like a fucking Slayer solo in it. I really like that. And you said Pap Smear wasn't like necessarily like a band, right? It was just more of like a side project that never came to fruition, or am I wrong?
It's a side project that never quite came together. So Slayer had already existed. According to Dave Lombardo, drummer of Slayer, longtime drummer, Jeff showed up to practice one day. He had his head shaved and he brought a bunch of punk records with him and he said, I'm into punk now. And he made them all listen to a bunch of punk. And he said to Dave Lombardo, let's start a punk band. So Jeff plays lead guitar and bass and sings in Pap Smear. Dave Lombardo obviously drums. They enlisted the help of the, at the time, guitarist of Suicidal Tendencies, and they recorded 4 songs on a tape. You can find them on YouTube. It's actually very good 80s punk. Like, it's very clear that Hanneman was really into punk. And what's interesting, it doesn't really sound like crossover. It doesn't really sound that metal. He's really going all in on kind of snotty California punk. Mean, dark, like humorous lyrics. Drunk Drivers Against Mad Mothers is literally just about alcoholics killing members of MAD. This never came to fruition. I don't think Pap Smear ever played a show. They only recorded these 4 songs. So this is a kind of a cool excuse for Jeff to dig up a couple of these songs. Damn is the best one. That's actually both this version and the original Pap Smear version are great. This is, for me, probably the highlight of the album because it's a track you weren't going to hear anywhere else at the time of its release. And it's basically an original Slayer song. And just, it's really solid. And again, it has a weird, crazy solo in it.
Hell yeah, dude. And you know, we're speaking of highlights. Next song here, let's get to the lowlights of this album. So there's 2 songs on here. Oh, I'm sorry, technically 3 songs that were Minor Threat covers. So we got Guilty of Being White and then Filler and I Don't Want to Hear It. Now, I'm just going to get my thoughts out of the way. Guilty of Being White cover here, awful. Fucking terrible. I hate it. And I don't hate necessarily the whole song. It's just the last line, which I told you before we recorded, like top 10 worst metal lyric of all time. And if you don't know, to the audience at home, so Guilty of Being White is originally, once again, a Minor Threat song. It's not actually like a racist song, right? It's like an anti-racist song, or is it?
So the thing with Guilty of Being White, the original song written by Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat when he was 15 years old. Minor Threat, not a racist band. And avowedly anti-racist, anti-white supremacist band. Guilty of Being White is a song that I think a kid would not write today because they would have more perspective on it. But what it's about is Ian MacKaye went to a school where, like, a majority black school. And growing up, especially in elementary school, he says he got bullied a lot and he got kids that didn't like him because he was white and he felt excluded and he would get beat up sometimes. And he was writing about that specifically. And what he says in the American Hardcore book and documentary is that, and this is a little naive to say as like a white guy, but I do believe what he says. He says, I know when I wrote Guilty of Being White that I was writing an anti-racist song, that I was saying, hey, I'm only guilty of being white, please don't judge me because of my skin. Now, I take that at face value because it's consistent with everything else Ian MacKaye has ever said and done. He also says, and what he says in the documentary, he says, hey, I was 15, 16 years old. How was I going to know that some nationalist right-wing group in Poland was going to hear my song and go, oh, it's so good that you speak for the white race? Like, how could I have known that as just some, 15-year-old kid? I think that's fair. And when this came out, he hated it. So the deal with this cover is that at the very end of the song, Tom Araya sings Guilty of Being White and Guilty of Being Right. Now, this is a song that alludes to lynchings, to slavery, to Jim Crow. So by adding that line, they're implicitly endorsing those things to my ear. Ian MacKaye hated this cover. I'm not saying that he's blameless. He was, obviously it comes from a certain place of privilege to even write that song.
And, we were talking about it real quick. So Kerry King said, and this is on the Wikipedia article, so it said Kerry King said the lyric was altered for tongue-in-cheek humor, saying that the band thought racism was ridiculous at the time. What does that even fucking mean?
Racism is ridiculous. Racism is ridiculous.
That is such a fucking cop-out answer to that shit.
Cowardly. I would have so much more respect for racists if they were just open about it than this fucking weaselly, where it's the dog whistle shit, where they speak to their audience and they go, no, that's not what I meant.
I mean, to be fair, that's what racists do all the time when they're called out on their fucking bullshit, too.
Yeah, of course. That's all of them.
All right, so with that bullshit out of the way, so let's get to Filler and I Don't Want to Hear It, which are the other 2 songs by Minor Threat, and I would say these are far less offensive to me, personally.
Minor Threat, great band. I do think Ian MacKaye's lyrics were great. I think.
I meant specifically the cover here is far less offensive to me than what Slayer did here, but yeah.
Well, so and I think I can just kind of do all my minor threat takes on this with all three. There's not a lot of variety in the three minor threat songs. All three of them, every minor threat song more or less sounds the same, but different riffs, and they're great. Minor Threat, one of the greatest punk bands of all time, obviously. That's another band that goes really well with Slayer's style, very naturally. The thing with Minor Threat is they were famous for being very tight for hardcore or for punk at all. Very tight, very riff focused, and with these shouty kind of hoarse vocalizations. So pretty easy for Slayer to make work in their style. They basically play them a little bit faster. I think Tom's vocals are a little corny, but that might just be because I'm so used to Ian's. Ian, by the way, in Minor Threat sounds like the dumbest guy in the world. Like, duh, duh, duh. He has the most duh voice I've ever heard.
God damn. Oh man. But yeah, no, I really liked this one. Obviously, definitely more than Guilty of Being White and some of the other covers. So I was like, okay, Slayer, let's bring it back in here. Let's make it a little less shit.
And I think my feelings on the Minor Threat material is that they kind of picked that to be like the singles. Minor Threat are, by a pretty wide margin, the most famous punk band on here, with the possible exception of the Stooges, I suppose.
No, totally. Like, I mean, Stooges are obviously in like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
whereas I don't think that Minor Threat are. I'd be shocked if they were.
No, they're not.
Next song on here is Spiritual Law, originally recorded by the band DI, and they actually have two songs on here. Now, I really loved their second cover, but Spiritual Law, I didn't really remember too much of it on my re-listen.
Oh man. So DI formed in Fullerton, California. The Spiritual Law cover is my favorite track on this album. So DI are another band who, similar to TSOL, they had kind of like a little bit of kind of gothiness to their, at least texturally to their sound, even though it's like very California skater, surfer, snot-nosed punk. So DI comes after this band called the Adolescents. Adolescents are one of my favorite bands. DI is formed by the drummer who becomes the singer, the drummer of Adolescents who then becomes the singer in DI, and guitarist Rick Agnew. Rick Agnew is one of my favorite guitarists ever. He's famous for mixing like hardcore punk with this kind of hollow, dead, gothy, like kind of harmonic sound. Very unusual for punk. And Spiritual Law is a great example of this song that it sounds simple, but there's all these there's little starts and stops. There's little like weird guitar tone tricks and short little bursts of solos, just things that really stand out in early 80s, East Bay punk. The reason I think this is my favorite song on the album is because, well, I don't sound much like Slayer at all. Slayer make this song work to their style so seamlessly. So the vocalists for DI are, again, very snotty, kind of flamboyant punk vocals, but Tom really makes them work with his delivery. The lyrics to this also are kind of anti-Christian, like occult lyrics. So it's really easy for Slayer to fit them into their whole milieu. And then this song has these kind of dark breakdowns and things in it. Slayer really fit their sound. They graft their style right over this to the point where this song, and there is one other song of this album, I think when you hear, I like, oh, this could just be a Slayer song, which I think speaks very highly of how well it works as a cover.
Yeah, no, I mean, in general, even though I didn't really have that much to say about Spiritual Law, like, once again, I like most of the songs in this album. I just didn't really have that much to say about it. But a song that I do actually have a lot to say about is Richard Hung Himself, which is the other cover by DI on here. And I really loved this fucking song. For me, it really hit basically everything I kind of wanted from, like, Slayer covers punk. And also, just in general, I just think the song should be called Dick Hung Himself instead. And it's about a porn star introducing himself to the world. No, that's a terrible
Dick.
joke. Yeah, Hung Dick, yeah. But no, I really like that song quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts about that one specifically?
Yeah, so Richard Hung Himself originally was a song by the band The Adolescents. They did demos of it. Of course, when the members left and started DI, they took it with them. This song works really well for me, I think, because it's so moody. If you listen to the DI version of this song, this is a really good example of a band mixing kind of goth vibes with like early-ish punk. The reason this works for Slayer, I think, is because it's kind of plotting. Like in the context of this album, Richard Hung Himself is a pretty slow song. It's very mid-tempo, but it really lets Slayer kind of lock into a groove, which is not a thing they get to do very much on this album because, of course, it's an album of thrash covers. So you get a little bit of, like, I wouldn't say they get to super show off, but you get some cool leads by Kerry King that, again, he doesn't get as many chances to do on this album as he does throughout. Also, this is just a cool song. The thing with covering, I think, like an old school punk song is they're usually pretty simple to play, but if it's well written, it's going to translate to almost anything anything. And this is a good example of this. And just by the way here, I suspect from listening to Pap Smear that DI was Jeff Hanneman's personal, maybe his favorite hardcore band, or the one that influenced Pap Smear most.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll have to listen to those. Because you said there was four other songs. I mean, two of them are on here, right? But you said it's four
Yes.
songs total. Interesting. I'll have to take a
Yes.
look at that. Because I did like the Pap Smear songs quite a bit, especially D-Damn. I like that one quite
Yeah.
a bit, obviously.
Yeah. Damn is my favorite track on the album, I think.
Hell yeah. Speaking of favorite tracks, so this next one here is Sick Boy, which was, I think the one that I mentioned earlier is on the European and Japanese standard edition, but not on the American standard edition. So I'm glad you mentioned it earlier, because otherwise I was going to skip this whole track, because I only do standard editions, or I should say we only do standard editions, because, that's just the way that the album was pretty much meant to be listened to originally.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. But I included it on here, obviously, Brian, because you said this was on your standard edition, so fuck yeah. So this is the Soul GBH song, right?
Yes, this is the only song by GBH or charged GBH on this album. Also, the only song on this album by a non-American band. The reason that I sort of insisted we talk about it is because GBH were part of the UK 82 movement in, obviously, the UK that was extremely foundational to American thrash metal. If you look at more than any other bands, GBH and the band Discharge were huge influences on not just Slayer, but on Metallica. Early Metallica especially were very influenced by GBH and Megadeth as well. And there's a couple of songs on here that I should say there were a couple bands featured on here that are more on the crossover end of punk, so they already have some metal influence. And when Slayer covers those crossover songs, it sounds so perfect for obvious reasons that it's like, oh, this just sounds like a Slayer song now. And that's how I feel about this GBH track. They're able to slot themselves so perfectly into that because they have to do some finagling with even Minor Threat and certainly with DI to kind of rearrange it and make it work in their style. But the GBH vibe is basically just like thrash metal, but a little bit sloppier. I also just think it's important because, again, it's the only UK band featured on here. And I would say GBH are probably, of these bands, every band on this album, that's the band who has had the most direct influence on thrash metal. Way more than Minor Threat or Verbal Abuse or whoever.
Yeah, I was gonna say I wouldn't say Minor Threat would have much influence on metal overall. They just don't strike me as being a band that has a lot of influence on metal. I'm gonna be real here.
I think a lot of metalheads obviously are fans of hardcore and so are fans of Minor Threat. But yeah, you don't really hear it. Not the way that you can hear metal bands that are influenced by, say, Black Flag,
Oh yeah, oh my God, there's so many metal bands. And of course grunge was heavily influenced by Black Flag too, especially Nirvana and stuff. So yeah, no, for sure. And then, we're talking about Discharge, like I don't think I've ever listened to Discharge, but I know that they influenced an entire subgenre called D-Beat. I know that.
D-Beat is silly as hell, but Discharge, you'd probably dig Discharge. But yeah, they were a huge influence on early thrash. Like I've heard old punk guys say that when Kill 'Em All came out, they heard it and they were like, oh, who are these metal guys ripping off Discharge?
Yeah, that's absolutely hilarious. And then the next cover on here is Mr. Freeze, and this is the soul cover from the band Dr. No. I fucking loved this song. This was like probably my top 2 or 3 favorite songs on the album. Just like I don't really know what to say beyond it. I was like really grooving out to this one.
So this is, again, so my favorite tracks on this album are Damn, which is by far, it's the closest to a really good original Slayer song, so I love it. But the best covers for me are Spiritual Laws and then Mr. Freeze by Dr. No, because it's the same thing. They were able to reinterpret it, but it works so well with their style, even though they kind of changed some things, that you hear it and you're just like, oh, this could just be a really good Slayer song. Dr. No formed in Oxnard, and the Oxnard hardcore scene called itself Nardcore, of course. They were an early hardcore band that added some metal influence. I wouldn't say they were crossover. We're not quite getting there. It's not like Corrosion of Conformity or something, but they have these really sharp guitars. They had more solos. I also don't have a ton to say about this song, except for that I think it's, along with Spiritual Law, it's the best cover on the album. Those 2 tracks for me, they really work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, this was the one of the songs that I was just like kind of grooving to like myself, that like a lot of the other songs, like I liked them once again, but this was like one of the more distinct songs for me. And of course, all of these are covers except for one song. So for me, I'm just like, shit, I might actually listen to the original one for this one.
Dr. No are great. The other reason I think that it might stand out for both of us is it is a little bit longer than, say, like the Verbal Abuse songs. There's a little more to sink your teeth. Like it's easier to find a groove because it's, more than a minute long.
Yeah, no, exactly, right? So, and then the next song on here is Violent Pacification, which is the soul song from DRI. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you here. Like, this one, even though I didn't hate it as much as the Guilty of Being White cover, this was like one of the least distinct songs because this is just a thing I just hate in like just music and punk in general, where the song is basically just like the lyrics are just a repeat of a same phrase. It just annoys the fuck out of me, and I just can't abide by it, I'll be honest with you. Because most of the lyrics on this are just the words violent pacification, and I just annoys the fuck out of me. I'm gonna be real here.
I can see that. So I like DRI a lot. This is not one of my favorite tracks on the album. One important thing about DRI is so they are like a crossover band. So they were one of the first bands to go all in on mixing hardcore punk and thrash metal. And that kind of makes this song a little redundant to me for Slayer to cover. Like say with TSOL, with DI, with Dr. No, whoever, it's kind of like they have to reinterpret these songs in some way. With Violent Pacification, Slayer can kind of just do it straightforward. This is also not my favorite DRI era. The first DRI album is called Dirty Rotten LP, and it has something like 40 songs on it. It's just really short, really abrasive songs, and it's awesome. This to me is kind of one of the things I don't like about, the style that we're calling crossover is that sometimes it's just like thrash metal, but without the chops, And I love hardcore punk that doesn't take any musical chops to play because kind of a band like Minor Threat or Verbal Abuse, they have to write to their strengths because they don't have the chops. But if you're like, well, what if I play thrash metal, but I only play a couple of notes instead of like a bunch of weird time signatures, and you know what I mean? Then it's like, well, okay, I guess. I would agree. I think this is a pretty redundant song. Again, I like DRI, but I don't know. I get why Slayer would cover this song. It fits their style well. I'm sure they're big fans of the band. But when you've got, I think, covers on here like Spiritual Laws and Mr. Freeze, where I think they can do some really cool things and maybe show off some different sides of themselves to their audience, this one doesn't do much for me.
Yeah, God, no, I totally agree with that. And, speaking of, covering songs that don't really fit their style and I think fail pretty miserably, the last cover song on here is called I'm Gonna Be Your God, in parentheses, I Want to Be Your Dog by the Stooges. And you said this is the worst song in the album, and I think this might be the worst song in the album. I don't hate this song, I want to be clear here, but it's a terrible cover of this song. It is just a bad cover, I'm gonna be real here.
I love the Stooges. Like, of every band on here, and I love Minor Threat, I love TSOL. But like the Stooges were a hugely formative band for me. I still listen to them all the time. So many bands have covered this song, and it's an easy song to cover and make pretty cool because it's a really simple, badass song. This fucking cover is so fucking corny, and there's nothing Slayer could have done. They shouldn't be covering the Stooges. On paper, when people talk about the Stooges, they go, "Oh, it's like punk," but it's kind of more complicated than that because it's this hazy, druggy, psychedelic kind of horned up energy. It's pretty different from Minor Threat. So already that's a strike against it. Of course, Iggy Pop, one of the great rock vocalists of all time, is a very cool, again, kind of strung out, dopey voice. Tom Araya's really serious kind of growl doesn't really work for that.
And obviously this song, covers the lyrics of, I Want to Be Your Dog. But like that song you're talking about, Strung Out, it's got like very like weirdly horny lyrics. I mean, of course, yeah. I don't really want to get into the things that Iggy Pop is horny about because that might put us on an FBI list. But like,
and it's got like cool things, like there's that cool single piano note, ding, 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 in the original that's just piercing through. Just weird, disorienting things in the original Stooges version. There are lyrical changes, of course, in I'm Gonna Be Your God, and they're so fucking corny. They make Slayer seem like the most sexless nerds in the world. Like, you take this song that's kind of edgy and dark, and it's about BDSM and drugs, and you change it into being about like, I'm gonna eat your pussy, and then I'm gonna bang you real good. And it's like, are you fucking dumb?
I mean, that's the thing. Like, I would say most metal in general is either horny in like a very unpleasant or very uninteresting way, or is very sexless. And like Slayer is one of those like metal bands that does sex songs that are like mostly sexless. Like it's a like Slayer should not be writing any songs that even remotely portray sex. I'm sorry. They're just not the fucking band for that.
Agreed. And then also like, why the lyrical changes? Like, were they like, well, I don't want to be some chick's dog. That makes me seem like I'm like a wuss, but I want to eat a pussy. Like, I don't.
I mean, we talked about, of course, Kerry King's very cringe politics, but like Tom Araya also has extremely cringe politics. Like, he's like a devout Catholic.
That's all I know about him, is that he's like a big time Catholic.
He's like a trad cath guy. Of course, his views on sex are going to be fucking ridiculously stupid.
I mean, this is just a baffling decision for me because this is hardcore songs, which it makes sense for Slayer to cover 80s punk songs. There is no part of Slayer that sounds influenced by the Stooges to me.
No, absolutely fucking not. Slayer is not druggy music. I mean, the only thing I can think of like druggy is like maybe meth druggy music for Slayer, but even then that's kind of pushing it. I'm gonna be real here.
And it's also just taking these thick, kind of fuzzy guitars that are in I Want to Be Your God and changing them into these chugging kind of cock rock guitars. It's so fucking lame.
It is, goddamn. And you know what? Let's just get this one out of the way. So this is the final song in the album, the only actual Slayer song in the album. And you talked about, just clumsy and things that don't really fit. So this is the song Gemini. This is also by far the longest song in the album. It's almost 5 minutes long. It's literally 1/7 of the total fucking length of the extended edition. So yeah, this is a pretty long song. And I think I mentioned earlier, it sounds like a fucking knockoff, like Alice in Chains song. It just doesn't fit with Slayer once again. This is just such an awkward thing for Slayer to try to fucking do here.
Slayer were in a pretty weird period at this point. They were kind of doing more mid-tempo stuff, which they'd had some success with in the past. Like South of Heaven, that whole album has some slower kind of songs, the less thrashy stuff, but it's so ominous and it works. Even Seasons in the Abyss, some of that's kind of corny, but some of that really works. This song to me does feel like they like half wrote it, like they kind of crapped it out, to be honest. It's like they were like, well, we need at least one original because our fans might, like, we probably have some fans that won't buy it if it's entirely covers. And it feels like that's why it's on here. And I would love if Slayer had written one original that made sense for this album. What if they had said, okay, we got an album of covers. What if we write like a really awesome thrash song that plays up our hardcore influence, And it could still be like 4 or 5 minutes, but maybe was really had cool, like really fast parts or something. It was like really, really angry. With this, like you described it as kind of like sludge metal, which I got to agree, but like bad sludge that isn't noisy or weird at all.
I'm gonna be honest, it sounds like a sludge metal song from like a local band that plays for like fucking wings and drink tickets at your local bar. I'm gonna be real here.
This is local band rock.
And also, like, I will say though, one thing I do really like about this song, I fucking love the drum fills on this song.
Lombardo is great. He sounds like he was getting bored and he had to keep himself invested.
Or no, this was Paul Bostoff.
Lombardo's out by that point. That's surprising. I was assuming Lombardo was out because he was in Pap Smear. My bad.
No, it's all good. But no, like, I really fucking love the drum fills on the song. And, there's some all right sludgy instrumentals on here. But otherwise than that, yeah, it just feels unfocused. It feels unfinished. Like I said, it feels like local bar band music. It's just not what Slayer should be fucking playing. I'm sorry.
It's an obligatory original song because they had to have one.
Exactly. It's like a song they wrote in like 20 fucking minutes and they recorded in about 30 minutes. God, but yeah, so that is the track listing here for Undisputed Attitude. Now, Brian, I think you showed me some Amazon reviews. Did you want to go over those Amazon reviews?
These are not from Amazon. These are reviews from markprindle.com. Mark Prindle was an early online record reviewer. I was a big fan of his site in the 2000s. Prindle famously would get some very unhinged replies to his reviews. For whatever reason, random people would find his website, which was just a personal blog site where he reviewed music, and they would get so mad at him, or they'd leave the most aggressive responses, and his site became kind of infamous for it. And I decided, remembering that he reviewed a lot of hardcore punk and that he did review Slayer at one point, I went to his page for this album. I went under the reviews, and I found this review from 2000. The Slayer page was started in 2004. I don't know if that's when this review was posted, but I'd assume it was not shortly after. This is by G Polo at MSN.com under the name Guido Morocco. Slayer goes punk. Just one thing to say. Fucking sell out. What's next? Slayer covers Green Day's greatest hits. Get back to metal or else you will join Metallica and lose fans from all over the world.
Also, by the way, I love Guido Morocco. That's like a name that like some like fucking hick racist would call somebody that they weren't sure what their ethnicity was.
Yeah, they had no idea where different countries were located.
Yeah, what the fuck are you? Are you some Guido Morocco?
There are some more thoughtful reviews on here that, are good, but I'm not going to read.
I found one from, and I'm just going to say this one because this was really hilarious, but Max9 from @foothill.net.
Yes.
This is John Poirer, and they say, the new Beethoven, the Black Sabbath of their era, hail the mighty Slayman. The fuck is
And
that?
yeah, this guy's just so excited about it. He also doesn't say anything about that album.
No, it fucking doesn't. Like, okay, the Beethoven, yeah, Beethoven definitely loved covering like 80s hardcore songs. Like, what the
Yeah.
fuck are...
And that's the thing with Mark's website is that he would get all these replies and it would be cut between these really kind of long paragraphs by music nerds, kind of like us, replying to what he said, and then random people who just stumbled on his website and just like abused him.
Oh god, I fucking love like early like mid-era internet. It's always full of this kind of bullshit.
A great thing is his site became kind of there's a few pages. His Linkin Park reviews page and his Miles Davis review page became infamous because they became stormed by fans just abusing him for giving those artists bad reviews. It's so funny.
Just specifically Linkin Park and Miles Davis being the ones is just really fucking funny.
One of the things I remember is, and Mark has said before, he's like, hey, I like some jazz, but I don't really get jazz. I like hard rock, I like metal, I like punk. You know, he likes rock. He's like, I don't really get jazz, so I'm gonna give it a bad review because I don't know. You know, but he just says what he thinks, and a lot of it he thought was boring. I love Miles Davis, by the way, but then all these snotty jazz guys would be like, well, you may not like him, but you have to respect him, and and like lecturing him. And then I remember Mark posted something where he was like, did a 2-sentence review of some Miles Davis album where he was like, another album of Miles holding a trumpet up to his ass and farting out of it. People got so mad.
I mean, the Linkin Park one is a little more surprising because even though, you know, Linkin Park are a band that has a very diehard fan base, like for the most part, they're fairly chill for like a diehard fan base. Like you don't really see too many Linkin Park fans sending death threats.
Yeah, but Linkin Park were still in the zeitgeist when he posted those reviews. This is still early 2000s.
Okay, that's
and
fair,
so this
yeah.
is like kids finding his page and going like, you're a fucking old piece of shit. You wish you were like Mike Shinoda.
Yeah, you wish you could rap as hard as Mike Shinoda.
Oh.
I mean, hey, listen, Mike Shinoda seems like a very nice person, but he is in the top 5 corniest rappers ever. Like,
he's just
easily.
so monotone. Like, I mean, he's good. He's pretty good, but he's so boring sounding.
Oh yeah, honestly, for like rap rock, he's definitely one of the better rap rock rappers. But yeah, he's just very monotone, very corny. Like once again, no hate to him. He seems like a personally very nice guy. But yeah,
seems like a cool guy.
But just very fucking corny and very monotone. Couldn't agree more on that one. Like if it was just Mike Shinoda and not Chester, I don't really know if Linkin Park would have went anywhere. I'm being honest with you.
I think Mike would have probably just been a DJ. Then he probably would have produced, like, done beats for other rappers if he hadn't hooked up with Linkin Park and the guys.
No, that's absolutely true. All right, so yeah, any final thoughts, Brian, or do you want to keep going on for? All right, let's go. Let's hear it.
So the deal with Undisputed Attitude by Slayer, we've kind of, Taylor and I think you'd agree, we've settled on when we talk about music. It tends to be, with one notable exception, we look at transitional albums in the history of like heavy music. That's, you know, quote unquote heavy music. We've talked obviously about Metallica kind of grappling with nu metal. Nu metal wasn't quite ascendant when this album came out, at least not on the national stage. But I feel like for Slayer, this is the beginning of their Lost in the Wilderness era. They have this great run through the 80s, and then they start to falter in the early 90s. I like a lot of this album, but this to me signals the end of like Slayer, like classic Slayer, into a kind of a goofy era. I think in retrospect, this album seems a little desperate because, like I said, I think it's them going like, we need to remind everyone that we're alternative too. We aren't just some cock rock metal guys, and we need to put out all these punk covers we like. And that's not to say that it's inauthentic. You can tell that Slayer are influenced by all this music and all their albums. You can tell they love it. But I think this was them sensing that they were starting to kind of age in the rock scene and trying to find a way to counter that. It didn't quite work out. Again, I'm not really sure who the person is that loves Undisputed Attitude, because you've got Slayer fans that love hardcore. There's a lot of overlap. If you're a punk rocker, Slayer are one of the metal bands, along with like Motorhead, that you probably fuck with. But who loves this album? Hardcore guys, a lot of them still don't like metal, and they definitely aren't going to want to hear covers of hardcore songs played better. A lot of them, even if they're being performative, are going to say it's phony. They're going to say that it's corny or something. The other side of that is I think there are a lot of hardcore fans that probably like Slayer, but are there a lot of big Slayer fans, especially at this point when they're sort of becoming bigger, that love hardcore? Is the guy that's seeing Slayer post Seasons in the Abyss, post American Records at festivals, does he want to hear fucking verbal abuse covers? Does he want to hear Richard hung himself? Does he know what that means? No, he's probably like, why the fuck are these songs so short?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like anybody who's seeing Slayer in 2024, like I'm gonna be real here. They want to listen to fucking Rain and Blood. You know, they want to hear Angel of Death. They want to hear songs from Seasons of the Abyss. They don't want to hear any covers at all.
And I think, this is the beginning of Slayer going through kind of a rough period. I would say that Slayer's loads were never as bad as, say, Anthrax or Metallica's, to be honest.
I totally agree with that. Like, I'm just gonna go real quick here. So,
Yeah,
even though, of course, we covered Saint Anger and we covered Lulu, which are albums that I think we both agree are not nearly as bad as what the fans say. But
no.
let's be real here. For a band of Metallica's caliber, they are bad albums for Metallica's
They fucked up.
Yeah, and even though I do like those albums, but they are bad Metallica albums. Even though Lulu's is not actually a Metallica album, it's a Lou Reed album, but people think it is. But either way, Anthrax, you said, is another band that had a pretty rough growing period in like the 90s and stuff like that. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say in the 90s, but they had Bring the Noise in the 90s, right? And that's like a pretty
earlier 90s. That's a great track. I mean, I love Anthrax, but they were pretty hit and miss pretty much throughout their career.
No, for sure.
The thing with Undisputed Attitude is that in retrospect, it was the beginning of Slayer feeling very old for a few years, because after this is their actual quote unquote new metal album.
Diabolus in Musica or something like that. Is that the one?
Yes, which is, don't want to try to pronounce it, which again, not that bad, but it is kind of goofy. It is awkward to hear because it is clearly them trying the same way that Saint Anger is for Metallica. It's them trying to figure out how to exist in the new metal scene, which they didn't need to do. They basically perfected the darkest version of thrash metal, and then they made it more atmospheric and slower in Seasons of the Abyss. And eventually they learned that. In the late 2000s, they kind of quit fucking around, they focused up, and they got back to just doing really solid, really dark thrash. But boy, I gotta say, in the 2000s, I don't know if there was a band that seemed more out of place with the changes that were happening in rock than Slayer, except for maybe Metallica.
Well, that's the thing. We talk about like awkward periods. Like I would say for like the big four, like, Slayer, once again, didn't make nearly as many fumbles as Metallica did. I would say that Megadeth, of course, had their very infamous Risk album, which I think is a bad album. I think it's a pretty bad album.
I love Megadeth. I don't know, I go back and forth on who my favorite thrash band is, but there are a lot of days where they're my favorite, but Risk is rough.
Yeah, it is a fucking rough album. And to be fair, every big band has a rough album. But like, if we're talking about like the worst album that came out of the big four, like Risk has to be up there in the conversation as being like one of the worst.
I mean, there are so many things that tie this to its era, not the least of which is the fact that they put out that Guilty of Being White cover and people are just like, that's a little weird. That's a little racist. And people just sort of accepted Slayer did a pretty racist cover of that song. And then we just let him continue existing.
Yeah. We just let Kerry King continue to look like he's in a fucking like white supremacist prison gang forever. We just let him do that.
Yeah. And then I love Slayer. I like, you know what? If they stick around after these two festival tours, I hope they put out another album because their last three albums were great. Like, so everything Slayer did throughout the 80s is great. It's like some of the best metal ever. And then I think that Christ Illusion and World Painted Blood are about as good as like Hello Waits or Seasons in the Abyss. So we'll see. Maybe they'll just reunite and play a couple of festivals. Maybe Kerry King will bug Tom into doing a full-scale tour. Boy, I kind of want them to do a new album because I don't want Kerry stuck doing this mediocre solo thing. Like, dude, I actually like Kerry's solos. I love that it's just this atonal white noise. I know metal nerds hate it because he doesn't know theory or whatever, but I don't want to see him go out on this corny solo album. I would rather Slayer just be kind of like AC/DC and maybe they just put out an album every 3 years that sounds the same, but it's just good, solid stuff that sounds like Slayer. I'd be okay with Slayer being like that forever until they all died.
No, absolutely. And, even though I'll be honest with you, like, I'm not super familiar with Slayer's discography, like, in general. I've only listened to really, like, the hits and stuff like that. Like I said, like, Rain and Blood and Angel of Death and stuff like that. I like Slayer as a band. I really like Tom Araya's, like, vocal style. I think it works really well with thrash, obviously. I mean, of course, they're one of the big four thrash bands, so I would hope that his vocal style works
Yeah.
with it. But, I love Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman as guitarists. They're fucking great guitarists, even though, of course, I have a lot of problems with Kerry King personally. He just is a very cringy,
he's a piece of shit.
He's a piece
Yeah.
of shit, exactly. But you can't deny he's an incredible fucking guitarist, especially for thrash metal. He's just the perfect like thrash metal guitarist, along with like fucking Kirk Hammett and like Scott Ian. They're just like incredible thrash metal guitarists.
So check out, like, if you're in any metal fan meme groups, check out what people say about Kerry King. People talk so much shit because his solos are just like noise. It is like totally atonal. And of course, all these theory nerds are like, oh, he doesn't know any theory. And it's like, no, it's awesome. His solo sounds so fucking chaotic. I love it.
And as somebody who's one of their favorite guitar, like probably one of my top 10 guitarists of all time is Wes Borland. I love fucking atonal noise bullshit.
Yeah.
Like I love that kind of stuff. So for me, it's totally fine. Like I have no problem with it.
Yeah, I think who would I recommend Undisputed Attitude to? I mean, again, I enjoy it. It's very fun. Would I recommend it to anyone as more than a time capsule? Maybe not. Again, there are about 5 other Slayer records that are just great, like perfect. Hell Await, Season of the Abyss, Show No Mercy, and especially Rain and Blood are amazing. And then, like, would I show this to someone to get them into hardcore punk? Like, probably not, because I would just show them Minor Threat or Black Flag, right?
Yeah, you might as well just show them the actual bands. And I guess if they want to hear, I guess maybe more metal, covers of punk songs, I guess they could always do that Rise of, what was that album? That was like all Black Flag covers.
Oh, Black on Black.
Yeah. They could do something
with all
like
the
that.
metalcore bands.
Yeah. So, maybe something like that. But yeah, I would say if you're trying to get a metal fan into punk, I would say this is probably not the best album for that. I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah. And again, I enjoy this because, again, I like Slayer and I love hardcore punk. If there's a perfect audience for this, it's me. And I still don't love it,
This is Brian Core.
and I still don't love it. Is the thing. So what's great about it is you get to hear 2 Pap Smear songs, which for a long time you had no way of hearing. And Damn, Drunk Drivers Against Bad Mothers is a great punk song. Jeff Hanneman wrote a great punk song, and for a long time you could only hear the Slayer version of it. So that alone is something I'd recommend this based on. Now you can just find the Pap Smear demo online, so it's kind of unnecessary in that way. I would say, again, I think that the covers of Spiritual Law and Mr. Freeze are so good that those 2 tracks, and maybe Richard Hung himself, I would recommend to Slayer fans. I would say, like, hey, if you like Slayer, these are some great Slayers. Like, they stand on their own as good Slayer tracks.
No, absolutely, 100%. And I would definitely not recommend I Want to Be Your God. I will say I will never recommend that one to anybody.
No, I Want to Be Your God and the cover of Guilty of Being White are embarrassments. They're embarrassments to Slayer, and they're embarrassments to the legendary bands that they cover.
100%, absolutely. And speaking of future embarrassments here, let's get into our pluggables with our final thoughts out of the way. So you know what? My pluggables here, so you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And also, please follow us on YouTube and Spotify, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously. And as well, of course, you can always donate to the GoFundMe for the Lucifer and the Father series. I know we've plugged it many, many times, but please, once again, donate to that GoFundMe because we want to see a second episode of this awesome series.
Yeah, please check out Lucifer and the Father. Check out their crowdfund effort because they've been great friends of the pod. They continue to be friends of the pod. I still, every once in a while, hear from Scott. He's just been a nice guy. And frankly, we have a lot of enemies, so it's nice to have a friend.
Yeah, we do have a lot of enemies out there, a lot of internal and external enemies.
We're talking about each other passive aggressively.
Yeah, we both consider each other outside agitators.
Trying to wrestle the show away from me.
Yeah. And then as well, Brian, of course, you have the social media profiles, correct?
Yes, please keep up to date with everything on Instagram and Facebook. Otherwise, you have to add us on our personal accounts, and nobody wants that. Yeah, the Millennials are old Facebook group, and Millennials are old pod on Instagram, where we post everything right away. And again, you get to see whatever, show off music I'm posting. That's my big innovation with the Instagram page is I can post music with it. Follow me on Twitter at JONSTABB at John Stab. I don't know if anyone's going to be on Twitter that much longer. It's become pretty unusable by this point.
Boy, is it ever.
It's literally just sex bots.
Well, that's the thing, Brian. I was going to say, if you follow us on YouTube and Spotify and Instagram and Facebook, I will post Bussy in your bio.
Yeah, Bussy and Pio.
Oh, God. But yeah, so with all that out of the way, I think undisputably, Brian, I'm going to fall asleep and I won't have an attitude about it like I usually do.
Yeah, I need to go. My neck is really stiff from trying to headbang as an old millennial all week.
You got to take a fucking Advil.
Oh, something.
Yeah. All right.
Guilty of being stiff.
You know what? I'm guilty of having a good night, everyone. Oh, that was terrible.
Guilty of having a good night.
Have a good night, everybody.